Hi, I'm Chip Hardwick. I'm the executive of the Synod of the Covenant, and I'm so glad that each of you are here live, and also for everyone who will be watching this afterwards. We're especially glad that all of you that are outside the Synod of the Covenant are here. You're very welcome. We provide this workshop, the Synod provides the workshop for anyone who wants to attend, and so I'm so glad that we have several of you here from outside the Synod, and you're very, very welcome. Of course, we're also glad that all of you from inside the Synod are here too. I'm going to share my screen and tell you a little bit about what's going on in the Synod of the Covenant, and then I will pray and then turn it over to our speaker, Wes Avram, this morning. And Paul, I'm sorry you heard this whole presentation exactly yesterday, so you're going to have it memorized by the end of the morning. I wanted to let you know that we had dozens of people apply for our higher education scholarship for Christian leaders. Those were due by May 31st, and we're running a little bit behind because of an illness in our office, and the winners will be announced by the end of July instead of the end of June because of that illness. But we're so glad that people who are in vocational schools or in associate's programs, college programs, or first degree in theology have applied for those, and we look forward to supporting as many as we can. You who were here last month for Craig Barnes know that that was a particularly impactful workshop. If you were not here, I'll put the link in for that YouTube into the chat when I get done making this presentation as well. It was, I think, one of our best received workshops that we've had so far. And today we're going to have another great one. Wes Avram, I'll introduce him more fully just in a second. I want to invite you to a cohort experience this fall. The leaders table is a presentation by a missiologist, Alan Roxborough. He has designed a program to help church leaders understand better the culture that we are in. Wes's presentation will help you do that today as well. This is a series of 4 cohorts. They'll be in the fall. I'll put the link in for this also. Those 4 cohorts will be in the fall, and you'll have a video to watch and then a chance to discuss them in a small group cohort with Alan as your host for that. Alan has written more than a dozen books on the missional church and is a real provocative and helpful thinker. It'll help us deal with polarized politics, the increasing rate of technological change, and the demise of the mainline church, and figure out what does it mean to lead in our culture that is going, that's going through these changes. Again, I think today's workshop will be really helpful for that as well. I also want to let you know and ask you to pray for a Synod grant that we put in with the Lilly Endowment, whom we affectionately called the Church's One Foundation. And we have applied for a grant called Cultivating the Gift of Preaching. And in this grant, our idea is to identify, train, and support emerging preachers in the Synod of the Covenant. These are preachers who have a call to preach and an interest in preaching, but have not yet had any rigorous theological education. And our goal is to have about 130 additional trained preachers throughout the Synod for stated supply, interim worship leadership, to complement the ministry of CREs. And we're very hopeful about this. We're partnering with Alma College, Johnson C. Smith Seminary, and the Presbytery of Cincinnati for this. We'll find out in the fall if we've received it. Please pray that the folks at Lilly will make the right decision with lots of wisdom, and that right decision will include our grant proposal. If you don't already receive our newsletter, you can do that by going to synodofthecovenant.org/subscribe. You can also find and follow us on Facebook and YouTube, and our website is there. And if I can be helpful to you in any way, here's my email address and my phone number. I'd be glad to hear from you. Now, it gives me pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Wes Avram. He is the senior pastor at Pinnacle Presbyterian Church in Scottsdale, Arizona. And he's also the director of the Park Center for Faith and Life at that church. He is a regular preacher. So although he is also an academic who has served as the college chaplain at Bates College and as professor of homiletics at Yale Divinity School, He is also a regular preacher, like so many of you. He's in the pulpit on a regular way. He knows the ins and the outs of preaching every week, and that adds so much richness to what he'll do today. He is the author of Where the Light Shines Through, and then another book, Anxious About Empire, and he is widely read in all sorts of different commentaries and other things. He and I share two schools, two alma maters in common. Northwestern University, where he received his PhD, and Princeton Seminary, where he did his MDiv. Wes has two grown sons living in Nashville, and his wife Lynn, the high school nurse. And he is from the Detroit area, and he has family in Ohio, if you got on after I mentioned that. So, Wes, welcome back, we'll say, to the Synod of the Covenant. Let's give him some happy hands to welcome him to this presentation. Wes, it's all you.
Chip, thank you, thank you. I am both honored and humbled by your invitation today. I've known Chip for a while, and you all should know that I hold him in very high regard, as I know you do too. And so it's just a thrill to be on screen with him and with all of you. I feel like I'm both coming from another planet here, since it's 7 in the morning where I am, not 9. And it was 2 days ago, it was 107 degrees. And today it's going to be a chilly 95. So we're dipping way back down today. So I'm already a little jealous. I feel like I've come home here on screen. I grew up in Royal Oak and just outside of Detroit, and spent my high school years in Rochester, what's now Rochester Hills. So in Royal Oak, my family my mother's side of the family were all long-term members of what is now Star Presbyterian Church, if you know that church. But it's now it was First United Presbyterian when I at 4 years old, my mother would take roll my sister and I in the stroller up to First Presbyterian. But then we were members of a little church in Clawson, an Episcopal church, and then a large United Methodist church in Rochester for many years.
Excuse me, Wes, for just 1 second. Charles Sadler, who's on he's the pastor at Star.
Are you really? Oh my goodness, I'm so glad to meet you. Well, thank you for the ministry of your church to my family. It's been many years now, but Star buried my grandmother at almost 99 years old some many years ago. So thank you. It's great to see you. When Chip talked about joining, first of all, I didn't know that I was going to be following Craig Barnes. I think if I'd known that, I would have said no, Chip, no. But only because who could do that? But I'm glad you've had a chance to talk with him, and I've watched some of the videos from some of the workshops you've done and really benefited from them. So I hope that this can at least be put a little word into that conversation today. What I want to do, sort of when Chip invited me to join you today, I started thinking about different approaches we could take to different topics, and I came back to him and said, hey, I'm involved in a project right now. One of whose leaders has actually joined us today, and that's David Wood, who's on our screen today, and he's here from Maine, but some of you may know David. David Wood and Andy Root from Luther Seminary are leading a Lilly-funded, the church's one foundation, a Lilly-funded project around what they call From Relevance to Resonance in Congregational Ministry. And that's a way of naming some themes to think about culture in a little different way than we often do. And I was talking to Chip about that project and what I was thinking about and reading, and thought I might like to try to apply some of those ideas and ask you to help me think about some cultural dynamics that we're all facing, even if we're facing in different ways, and how they impact the life of the preacher, how preaching is heard, and what the real life experience is of folks in our congregations. And connected with this, we are actually in my church in Scottsdale. We have people from all over the country. People are moving here, and so I probably have a dozen people in my congregation who actually grew up here. And we have a lot of folks from Michigan and from Illinois and Ohio here, and they all sort of bring their life experience with them. And we have decided as a staff that we need for a moment or two to stop asking people about programs and what they want from the church, and start asking them about their lives, about how are they actually living their lives. And because part of what we're hearing, and I'd be really interested in our conversation today to hear if you're hearing the same thing or seeing the same things in your own contexts, however different they might be, that even now, post-pandemic, culture has changed in ways that we don't even begin to understand. There's just this overwhelming sense that things are different. And we're trying to name how different things are. And yet, just as we begin to describe the difference, it changes again. And then it changes again. And then it changes again. And I find members of the congregation, as well as our pastoral staff and other program staff at the church, stammering a lot. We just stammer because we don't know how to catch up, even in our description of what life is like right now. And I think I find myself stammering in the pulpit quite a bit for the same reason. I stammer, I qualify, I rethink, I rework, because I'm not sure how to make a connection to people's lives, because I'm not quite sure what they're experiencing in their lives. So we decided to take a pause in asking about programs and in doing vision plans, and to actually do some focus groups in the congregation with no mention of programs. So each of our pastors is organizing a group in the congregation, and we're gathering some resources that I'm going to be talking to you about in a minute. And we're sitting down with these groups of invited people from their areas of ministry and just talking about their lives with no reference to church programs at all. And we're going to have to really discipline ourselves because we tend to be I think at least, we tend to be very instrumental in the church. And you serve in your own context. I serve a bunch of concrete, sequential, achievement-oriented kind of people who are always talking about what's the bottom line, what's the bottom line, what are you going to do, what's the takeaway, what's the takeaway? And we're going to say we're not answering any of those questions. We're not even going to try. We just want to know what it feels like when they get up in the morning, what it feels like by noon, what it feels like by the time they might get home, but it might not even be for dinner. What it feels like with the kids, what it feels like with parents, what it feels like in the retirement homes, what it feels like when they go to the doctor, what it feels like when they turn the television on or the computer on, what life feels like today. And then bring groups together and have them start talking to each other, and purposely not answer the question about what. Just listen, and then see what bubbles from all of that. And we're going to guide that listening a little bit. And we're going to guide it with some of the work from that project that I mentioned earlier with Lily. And so I want to work through some of those ideas. And they come from a German sociologist. And David, chime in here. You know this work very well if you want to add anything to this. But German sociologist named Hartmut Rosa, who writes about a set of cultural dynamics that are a little different from not necessarily original. They sound familiar, but he puts them together in a way that are a little different from how I think we tend to normally talk about culture and politics in the church. I think this is, from my experience, yours may be different, that as I watched students who were studying preaching when I was teaching in a divinity school, and the question of politics and culture came up, the question was usually also more instrumental, was how do I preach about a topic? How do I preach about racism? How do I preach about politics? How do I preach about, it was all, how do I take a topic from the political world, a topic from the cultural or economic world, and ask, how do I preach about it? We rarely talked about how do I preach inside it? How do I preach in the midst of a culture that is experiencing such and such? How does the things that we're experiencing, how do they impact the preaching, the work of preaching, not the topics of preaching, not, not what we interpret, how we interpret scripture, but how preaching itself happens.
Wes, I muted you by accident.
Oh, there we go. When did you lose me? You might have wanted to. When did you lose me?
Just now.
Okay. French theologian, some of you may know Paul Ricoeur, philosophical theologian, wrote in an essay some years ago, I think called The Language of the Gospel. He talked about the pre-homiletic work of the preacher. And what he meant by that was how the work of the preacher in restoring or raising to attention the context in which people can hear the gospel. In his writing, he was interested in how in a scientific culture we lose the ability to think metaphorically. And so he said, the preacher has a lot of work to do to help people think in metaphors in order to understand the gospel. And so in that sense, we have to use and talk about, we have to be reflective about how we use metaphors, right? Maybe that changes how you preach about the Trinity. I don't know. But I want to take that idea about the pre-homiletic work that we have to do in restoring the ability to hear and raise other questions than what Ricoeur did and actually borrow some ideas from Rosa. So what I'd like to do is show you some slides, talk about the thinking of this sociologist, Hartmut Rosa. Have any of you, with hands, have any of you heard the name Rosa at all? Aha, I see a couple. Oh, good. In Royal Oak, they've got Hartmut Rosa has made it to Royal Oak. You may hear more of his writing as more of it gets translated into English. He is one of the thinkers of acceleration. Others have written about it, from Mark Taylor to Doug Rushkoff, other people, about the impact of constant acceleration on culture and human being. But he writes about it in a very thorough and very careful way and talks about its impact, its origins and impact throughout all of our culture and how it impacts across cultural contexts. That the experience of acceleration in culture has an impact on us no matter where we are in our situation. It impacts us in different ways. But even if one doesn't participate in the constant acceleration of things, one knows one doesn't. That you can see around you acceleration and you know you're not part of it. So even if we're not in it, we understand ourselves over against it. It separates communities. Communities understand themselves as either part of the flow in the traffic lane or out of the traffic lane. That's kind of how we see ourselves. We're in the traffic or out of the traffic. And so we understand ourselves in relation to the highway, whether we're on it or not. And so acceleration has an impact on all of us. And I see it, even over the last 10 years, I see it impacting how people hear in the congregation, their level of patience, their level of openness, their the sense of life that they bring with them to church is all impacted by these phenomena. So I want to take a moment, take a step back, and just walk through carefully some of what Rosa says, then turn off the PowerPoint and ask you if it makes any sense of your context, and then move in to do a little bit of that pre-homiletic work. Right? Ask the question, what now? How do we respond? So I get to the how, even though I told you earlier I don't want to, we will. So I'm going to jump, unless anybody has any comments about what I just said, anything you want me to say more about or anything that makes sense or doesn't, or I'll just jump right to the share. I'd be tempted, to be honest, and here's a product of acceleration. My preference would be to go around the screen and have a conversation with each one of you about your setting and your context. We don't have time. We don't have time, which I think is the maybe hallmark of our culture today. We don't have time. So let's see if we can back into that a little bit. But can we have, all right. Are we screen shaming? Is that working? Perfect. But I'm not seeing the whole screen here. Here we go. Let's see. All right. Whoops. How did I jump ahead here? Here we go. Here we go. Acceleration, amplification, accumulation, alienation. Preaching in times like these. And this whole discussion, as I mentioned, is informed by one book, which may be a really good way to get into Rosa's writing, is a smaller book, which was translated by James Wager, but their book is called The Uncontrollability of the World. I recommend it to you. It's I actually had all of our pastors read it, and some of them looked at me as though I was crazy, but we had then we spent an hour together just talking about it, and it's kind of given a language that we keep coming back to as a pastoral staff. The assumption in this little book called The Uncontrollability of the World is that how we relate to the world and to God is not given, but depends on the cultural conditions into which we've been socialized. Now, that sort of stands to reason, but sometimes it's important to just state common sense, right? And then see where it takes us. One of his assumptions too, and you can revise this if you like, but he puts it in a way which certainly gets me pondering about the life experience and the attitudes of people that I serve. For late modern people, he suggests that world or the life we live has actually become a point of aggression. That we take it as a given. It's just taken as common sense by so many of our folks, and certainly the folks I serve, is that we are competing, we're struggling, we're seeking to subdue, we're in a battle with our context, with our nature, with society to overcome, to get up, to take care of things, to resolve problems, to win. And even if we understand ourselves as losers or as marginalized and experience ourselves that way, we understand ourselves in relationship to a culture of aggression. And I see that in parents. I see that in youth. I see that I was a college chaplain in the 1990s, and I think I see it in our high school youth even more today. This sense that they're the life is already, even their teen years, a struggle. They're struggling with themselves. They're struggling with their peers. They're struggling with vocation. They're struggling with dreams. They're struggling with their own identity. It's a kind of, and the struggle is not a journey. For some it is. The most healthy and beautiful and faith-inspired ones among them, this struggle becomes a journey of discovery. But for so many of our folks across the generations, the struggle is not a journey of discovery. The struggle is it's trying to eke out a minor victory here and there. And I see that in the kind of questions I ask. I see that in the kind of how people come into the sanctuary on Sundays or to committee meetings on Wednesdays. Hartman says that the great gambit of modern culture in the West is that modern societies stabilize themselves dynamically, with which he means we're only secure when we're moving. That is through escalation. We're structurally, institutionally compelled to bring more and more of the world under control and within reach, technologically, economically, and politically, to develop resources, open markets, activate social and psychological potentials, enhance technological capabilities, deepen knowledge bases, improve possibilities of control, and so on. And we can breathe after that. It's a long sentence, but it seems to speak to a lot of the world around us, that we are, that if, and we even say it in the church, if we're not growing, we're falling back. If we're not changing, we're falling behind. I hear that all the time. And this continual sense that we have to, and I use the language. I talk about innovation. I talk about being nimble. I talk about, being flexible in our structures. We're continually saying no more 5-year plans. We're just going to go. We're going to keep. Whoops. Why do I keep jumping ahead here? Sorry. We keep. We only. If we're not moving, we're falling behind, and that is the taken for granted in modern culture. That's how we've structured our economics. We've structured medical, we've structured healthcare, we've structured church life, we've structured all the basic institutions of our lives around this idea that he calls dynamic stabilization, that we're not stable unless we're moving. That we might take it for granted, but it might not be the only way. But for him, stability is movement. These 5 things are sort of my 5 A's that I think that have an impact on that. Acceleration, accumulation, that we, as structures of community life, family life, social safety nets, as structures of support become more and more porous and loose, and more holes in them, we are continually trying to shore ourselves up against potential collapse. And I see that in family life. I see that in how people make their decisions about stewardship. They're always calculating what they're going to lose if they give. Generosity becomes generosity is not a way of building community. Generosity is a kind of way of calculating risk, mitigating risk. How much can I do to feel good about what I'm doing without risking too much? Because we have to continue to accumulate structures around us to protect us, because we're more and more isolated from each other. Amplification, the loudest voice wins, the fastest idea. We have to amplify. Sometimes we want to amplify voices that are silenced, but in a culture of amplification, amplifying voices that are silenced can be drowned out by simply a shouting match. That the louder and faster is the idea that gets the most attention. And so we enter a culture of argumentation, that we see argument more and more as a way to reach a goal rather than conversation, which leads in Rosa's view to alienation, alienated from ourselves, from each other. Communities become more problematic. We continue to use the language of community, and sometimes the word that's used the most is the word that's most fragile. And we have so many communities now. We have you have a community around which grocery store you go to. I'm the Whole Foods community. We use the language of community so often, maybe in part to signal how fragile it is in our life, that we are profoundly alienated from each other. So we're continually trying to use the language as an antidote to our fragility. As I mentioned before, lack is defined and experienced over against those 4 things. Rosa would say, and I think he might be right, but I'm curious if you disagree, that this is all exaggerated and exponentially so in the 21st century. We have a member of my congregation who directs the undergraduate writing program at Arizona State University. So he has like 8,000 students in his program. And he is now very involved with artificial intelligence. And we've had a couple of forums at the church about this. And he's not entirely an opponent of it, but he is saying that writing is profoundly changing how we teach writing, what that's all about, how we teach composition and creativity. Artificial intelligence is profoundly changing all of that. And it's exponentially exaggerating now. So these processes are only speeding up, which makes the world a point of aggression. The impact, according to Rosa, is that the tremendously powerful idea that the key to a good life, a better life, lies in expanding our share of the world, has arisen as a cultural correlate to the structural logic of dynamic stabilization in modernity's understanding of itself. Meaning, if you're not expanding, you're contracting. It works its way into the tiniest pores of our psychological and emotional life. Our life will be better if we manage to bring more within our reach. This is the mantra of modern life, unspoken but relentlessly reiterated and reified in our actions and behaviors. It's an academic sentence, but I think there's something true in that, even for people who don't have resources and agency to do it in an extroverted way. I tend to be surrounded by people who have those resources and agency, and they do all of this on a public stage. But I think people with fewer of those resources and a less sense of an agency and ability to affect the world are doing that internally. And we're still in this sort of struggling, striving sort of mode, looking for something. And sometimes we don't even know what we're looking for. In very brief, Rosa describes 4 dimensions of all of this. We try to make the world visible and knowable, that we try to understand all things. I was in Ralph Waldo Emerson Elementary School in Royal Oak. I was part of the Look It Up Club in the 1960s when I was in 5th grade or something. The Look It Up Club was a little club in the school trying to teach kids how to use dictionaries and encyclopedias to look things up. We don't guess, we look it up. That was the phrase of this little club. We don't guess, we look it up. But the whole idea was that knowledge, I don't know, I don't want to romanticize it. I'm just observing that knowledge, even in the 60s, was something to be worked for. We have to earn it. You have to know how to use a dictionary. You have to know how to use an encyclopedia. You have to know how to get the information you need. And so don't guess, look it up. That's so profoundly different from my kids who have in their pocket, they have Siri in their pocket. And they don't have to look it up. They just ask Siri and Siri gives an answer. But they have very little critical capacity to really interpret the answer. They just take it, right? And use it. And it's wonderful. I do it too, but it's a different relationship to knowledge. We're continually grasping to know more and more and more because we assume it's all accessible to us. So we try to make the world accessible and reachable. It's like you said, life is sort of a land grab world. We try to make the world manageable. And that's in its origins part of the modern world. Cartography, making of maps, right along with colonialism. Even national grammars. There's a philosopher I studied with quite a bit that I admire named Ivan Illich, and Illich talks about 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That was actually the same year that the Queen of Spain finally gave de Bruges permission to write the grammar of Spanish, which for decades she had continued to refuse to give this scholar the freedom and money to write a grammar of Spanish, the Spanish language, because her comment was the Queen has no authority over the language of the vernacular of the people. The Queen has no authority over the language of the village. And finally, he convinced her to let him do this by saying, if you want to be a modern queen with power over your people, you have to control their language. And she gave him permission to write the first national grammar in Europe. And hence, Illich would say that's the beginning of the modern world. This notion of managing local culture, managing the person, this idea of management begins with the writing of grammars of national languages. And now it's all around us. We try to make the world useful, and we interpret power as in light of these 5 things, in light of acceleration and amplification and accumulation and argumentation and alienation. That's how we interpret power, and we lose a sense of power as relationship and relational capital, or of relationship with nature. So anyway, he would say that every part of our life is impacted by this. How we see our bodies, our psyches, our emotions, vocations, relations, community, every part of our life, even how we travel, how we think about the church, all become points of aggression, unconscious tilt toward being up. I see in my context, and maybe it's because I serve in a place where people are coming and going a lot, because a lot of people are moving here, but I see more and more now in my ministry, it's the third church that I've served. More now than ever before, people come to church already looking for something. They're not looking for church. They're looking for confirmation. They're looking for a place, as they would say, where they're going to not be challenged. And if they're challenged, they go somewhere else. Because we have a lot of churches. And now, even in these last few years, people have run for the edges. We have more and more, and this is kind of a sad comment, but more and more people in my congregation think alike. They have less tolerance of being with people who think differently than they do. And so they listen to sermons differently. I find it harder and harder to make a point to challenge, maybe, to say something that might make someone a little uncomfortable, because they'll just go somewhere else. And it's really profound. And I have found that, the old saying says you earn credibility at the hospital bed. I'm not sure we do anymore. I don't know where we earn credibility. I don't know if we do have credibility. I don't know what happens to the credibility of the preacher to say hard things in a culture where we don't have the sense of cohesion to be able to listen to each other. So anyway, I'm coming to the last of the slides. But so the summary here, and this is also a quote from Rosa, that our formation of modernity turns out to be, in a way, doubly calibrated for the strategy of making the world controllable, which is a way of saying it actually produces the opposite of what it wants to. We're structurally compelled from without and driven from within to turn the world into a point of aggression. It appears to us as something to be known, exploited, attained, appropriated, mastered, controlled. And often it's not just about bringing parts of the world within reach, but about making them faster and easier and cheaper and more efficient, less resistant, and more reliably controllable. But it fails. It does, for many of us, the opposite. The world loses color and voice and meaning. My wife, as Chip said, is a high school nurse, and she sees, in a school of about 1,200 students, she sees about 60 students a day, between 50 to 60 students a day. A third of them are mental health. And she's a medical person. She's not a mental health professional. But even the counseling services are overwhelmed. And she sees anxiety disorders, depression, eating disorders, just significant mental health issues. And he says, and it's only increasing, and it's even worse since the pandemic. Said that the world, for so many of these teenagers, which may be the canaries in the mine for us, the world has lost color, it's lost voice, it's lost meaning. For us also, time flattens into the present. We lose a sense of ability to imagine a future reliably, and we lose connection to the past, and so we're only in the moment. Relationships become rationalized, parceled out. We don't have time. I even find that as a pastor. I have less time for people today than I had 15 years ago, because there's more to do. And it's kind of a shame. So much of the kind of relationships that I went into the ministry to cultivate are the very things that are withheld from us that we have to manage. We parcel out our time as pastors. And so we have rush, uncertainty, fear, anxiety, and rage, which are the opposite of what control is supposed to give us. And I'd be curious if you see other things too that we lose. So what's next? If we don't hear the world, if the world doesn't speak to us, for Rosa, there's a kind of and he does source it theologically. There's a theologically sourced sort of antidote for this, and he tries to develop an idea of resonance. And resonance is not just a metaphor for an experience or an emotion, but it's a way of relating. It's a way of pausing. It's a way of living in a culture of alienation and argumentation and accumulation and acceleration. It's a way of living in those realities differently, inviting people to live differently, so that we can let the world call us. We can let life and experience claim us. We can find zones where we're not competing. We can reach toward the world with responsibility and subjectivity, and we can create cultures that take responsibility. There's a group, it's a Lutheran-based group now that's going around the country working particularly with youth groups Many of you have contacted this. I think it's called they may have changed it now with inflation, but I think it was called like the 1,000 Project, which they were encouraging youth groups to for churches to give a youth group $1,000. That's all, just if you have it, $1,000, and say in a year, I'm not exactly sure this is particularly accurate, but something like it, take a year and go out into the community and meet organizations and groups that are working with people. And just decide in a year or in 6 months, we're going to give somebody $1,000. You're just going to do that as a youth group. You're going to give some group $1,000, but you have to figure out what group you're going to give it to. And she says it transforms the works of these. He says these youth groups begin to ask questions, develop relationships. They begin to take responsibility. They begin to think that they're in relationship to, and then it tends to multiply into long-term relationships for just one single gift. But don't just give it away. You guys said you have to meet the people before you give it to them. That's sort of self-efficacy, as Russell would say. Adaptive transformation is part of the experience of resonance, where suddenly we're stepping out of controllability and we're letting ourselves be impacted and affected by the world we're trying to create. And then openness to surprise. I don't mean dread of the unknowable, but openness to surprise, letting God, as the missional cliche is, let God show up. We be open to the possibility of surprise. And I'd say that in scripture and in preaching too. Wise preacher once said to me early in my ministry, and I've not followed this very well, is that if you told the whole story, you've told too much. Let people do some work. Let people be surprised. Leave room for, leave something open in your sermon that's incomplete. Don't finish every loop. Let surprise happen as well, open-endedness. So the question I have for you all is, where are we? Where are you in the light of this? Does this make any sense of your life, the life of your congregation? Is it, do you look at that and say, yeah, I know all that? Or does this come together in a way that that also helps you think about who your congregants are as hearers? How can they hear the word of the gospel in a world that is for them a point of aggression? How can the church be an agent of resonance in the world when we're also just fighting for our very survival? When the health of and the existence of our institution is not, our institutions is not secure. We don't know for sure if our churches will be here 10 years from now. I mean, I'll be honest. One of you might, there's a couple of churches here, you might have a very large endowment, which will help you survive for a while. But aside from that, and maybe that's not really surviving, our communities are fragile. And yet we also want to claim a space and be a word of grace and confidence. We work against dynamic stabilization and be agents in the world. So how do we do that? I'm going to stop the share and stop now and ask you if there's anything here that resonates with you or opens any questions.
I'll go. I'll go, Dr. Avram.
Oh, please.
It certainly resonates with me, and I'm grateful for your presentation. I think it names our current culture and where we are. And I don't think we can really preach about this topic, but we are certainly, as you said in the beginning of your presentation, preaching within this current reality. And I see my task as a preacher too is to try to offer a prophetic alternative, along the lines, the very last part about the resonance, those last 5 parts, to be able to paint a picture of what living in the kingdom of heaven is, which is here and proclaimed as Jesus said. But I think, and it's a very pessimistic view, I think, that you've named, but I think people are feeling that kind of pessimism in my context. The people who are coming into the church, seeing a lot more people here, better than but more than like 5-10 years ago, even before the pandemic. But I think it's because people have realized that this competing and the culture's way of living and surviving is failing them, and is causing them to be quite desperate in their lives. I appreciate all the A's. The one that I have another one for you, and I mean you already have too many really, but and maybe you put it under the accumulation category, but I would say achievement. You talked all around it in terms of the sense that people really do believe that they're in competition to get to the top of not even the top anymore. It's just to make it to that middle class or upper middle class kind of life. I finished reading recently. It's not that new, but it's not that old either. The Tyranny of Merit by Michael Sandel. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he talks about how our society, which is really based on a meritocracy, is an illusion. We don't think it's an illusion, but so that when you get to the top, the cultural elites think they've earned their place. But a rise of this concept of winning and losing was part of the appeal of, and is the appeal, I think, of Trump and Trumpism, because those who have been left behind finally have an advocate for them, and we're going to win. But you don't hear other politicians talking in that kind of language. Traditional Republicans or Democrats talking in terms of this winning and losing language, but those who are talking have won, really, the cultural elites, and thinking about the common good in this way. But I guess I don't have a question, but I do think people in this kind of context are also very tired. Which loops back to where you began with your church, talking about we're not even talking about programs anymore, because another program that's not going to connect with people is just one more thing to do. But there are, I mean, I'm thinking about programs now in terms of just how we gather and organize. I mean, a program is just a way to organize people, and really your focus groups are a program, whether you want to name that as such or not, right? Right. So and I think people do appreciate these forums and gathering and doing life together. And in my particular context, we've had a lot of growth in this like family demographic, but it's not through programs, but it's those people are now asking, like, shouldn't we be doing stuff together, together? So the programs are coming up much more organically in my context, and we're not trying to over program, because the reality is we don't know what the programs are anymore. And that's how if we try to do a program, we got to put it on a best program and 2 people show up because of all of this. But that doesn't mean that people don't want to be together. It's just that we don't know what the programs look like, I think, that are going to connect and reach in our current society, because things have changed so quickly. So those are just some thoughts and comments.
I mean, thank you for that corrective too. And there's a streak of pessimism in what I'm describing, but I also need to add that we shouldn't lose or forget, I think, the value of what we do, because we do have the antidote. We are living it. The liturgy gathering, the pre-modern memory in the church is something that people need and experience probably in ways we take for granted. I mean, I'm sure you've also received these kinds of letters. I got a letter about 2 weeks ago from a young, a mother in the congregation, probably in her late 30s, 2 children, She's been coming to the church now for a few years, and I don't know her well, but I've always had the impression that this was a perfectly intact family doing really well. And this letter was really profoundly, it just was eye-opening for me. And I realized how much I take for granted that I shouldn't. Both how the power of the church, but also how to pay more attention to people's lives. When she just said, I'm writing a letter just to thank you. When I first came to the church, I was at an extremely difficult point in my life. I was experiencing depression. I was experiencing aimlessness. I didn't know who I was as a mother. I didn't know who I was in my work life. I just was lost in so many ways, and I didn't know where to go. And so I came to the church. And slowly over time, the church healed me and healed my family. And there was no, she didn't name it. She didn't go to a program for grieving, families, or she didn't go to motherhood preschool, or she didn't do any of that stuff. She just sat in the pew and was so grateful for that. And I, out of that, both said, I need to know more about people's lives, but also that I can't just think what we're doing, the power in just what we do over the long period of time, and the slow work of the church, and the work of the pulpit, the work of liturgy, the work of what we do does have an impact, right? So I don't mean to be, there's a resonance there. And she was talking about experiencing resonance that she didn't have any else in her life. Barb, you have your hand up from Pontiac, up the road from Rochester.
Up the road,
Yeah.
just a little west of Rochester. I wonder if maybe as I'm hearing all of this, if maybe our role as church is to say, we don't have to do that.
Mhm.
To give people permission to be who they authentically are.
How do you help people? I mean, this may be too abstract, but to see that work as not in competition with themselves, as not a point of aggression, as we say, but actually a journey and possibility of discovery, right? To find who they are with each other without fear, without anxiety, without feeling like they have to be rushed to do it. Any positive experiences with that?
I'm in a very, I was going to say I'm in a very unusual situation. I'm not sure I am. My congregation is small, it's older, it's tired, it's discouraged.
Mm.
And, the tension is, you said you don't know how many of our congregations are going to be here in 10 years. I'm not sure mine is going to be here in 2.
Yeah. Coming out of the pandemic, Barb, I don't know if you experienced this, but I had a member of my staff who was just relentless about saying, we just need to be together. We just need to be together. We just need to be together. And her response was, throw food at people. Just feed them. Right? He says, who cares how much it costs? Just feed them, feed them, feed them, feed them, to get them together again so we can remember what it means to be together. And she was absolutely right. We were calculating the background. Can we do that? Can we afford this? Can we do that? And she just was, no, she said, forget it, just do it. And she was so right? That sometimes we just, like, irrespective of all the calculations, we just connect, right? And then see what happens, right? maybe there are moments like that when, and sometimes I think that you find stories in scripture about that. You find those stories of open-endedness and discovery. A couple other hands. I think Robert, you had your hand up first, and then I see Teresa and Jose.
Yes, I want to go back to your Look It Up Club. As a context, I'm a retired engineering academic, so that gives you some context. I'm concerned that I think one of our roles has to be a curator of some of the things people look up. I'm really concerned about all the unreliable information people bring as fact with them. And so I just hope we can work that into our thought process, that we still have responsibility for helping people sort things out of whether or not that's what they get is real and reliable or not. And I'll just stop there.
No, I think that's right. And it can be overwhelming though, because we don't know everything about everything. Right? And so we started, and we were helped in doing this. We started a program at Pinnacle called Courageous Conversations, in which prior to the pandemic, we were doing it about once a month. We're doing it a little less often now, but we come together, and it's voluntary. It's not in the church service. It's after church, where people who want to can come into a side room, and we prepare it. We prepare the conversation with, and we is for a long time with some facts. We lay out some thinking about different points of view on a topic, and then we just let it go and let people talk across differences about topics that are in the church and in the culture, and try to mutually correct each other and help each other. It's not always easy, but we also have a ritual, and I learned this from Alan Hilton, who does this work, but we have a ritual that every once in a while, anyone in the room can call out our phrase, and together everyone in the room says, listen for what the Spirit is saying to the church. And we're really careful to say it's listen for what, not listen to what. So we're not saying that anything anyone says is the Spirit talking to the church, but we're saying in the midst of what people are saying, the Spirit is talking. And we always have to correct it, because people's impulse is to say, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the church. And then we stop and say, no, it's listen for what the Spirit is saying to the church. So we all can make mistakes. And but even then, God still works, right? I don't know. That's not an answer, but that's one little way that we've tried to respond to that. It's that. Teresa, I think you had your hand up. I know Kenton. I know Kenton.
I was sitting here thinking in context of what you're talking about. I serve as an interim / transitional pastor. And one of the pieces that I regularly have to address is fear and anxiety within a congregation, because they're in this unknown territory. And it has just kind of fed into life after the pandemic. And so we've just continued to have those conversations in addressing our own anxiety, our own fear of the unknown in such a time as this. And during Lent, I stumbled across a sermon series that was suggested in Reformed worship. And I thought, oh, well, let's try this. And that it had little scenarios for characters that you could talk about. And the theme was in the wilderness, and meeting how God, through Christ, comes to care for us in those places. And some of the characters were more well-known, others we didn't know so much about, but it was, how does God come and meet us in those places where we are anxious, where we are fearful, where we have given up hope, and then translating that into our own context. So do we have the eyes and the ears to see how God is caring for us? And challenging the congregation then to be that representative, though, that God is sending to someone to care for them. And it's continued on where we're not in that particular theme, but we continue to have those sorts of conversations within sermons, talking about those things that make us anxious and things that we don't have any control over. And I think that's been an important aspect to talk about honestly from the pulpit, to just say, I don't know. And here we are, but we're going to continue to walk faithfully.
Teresa, does that impact the kind of stories you choose from Scripture, or the text you or themes you choose to preach on?
I tend to be a lectionary preacher, and it's amazing how you can start to read that text well from a different perspective. And I have, I was reading about Elijah and I thought I knew Elijah pretty well. And then all of a sudden I'm hearing Elijah in a very, very different way. And, right. And so it's fascinating how you can take familiar passages and hear a different message.
I actually preached a series of sermons on those 5 A's, right? And in the sermon on amplification, we used the story of the still small voice. And I had never seen before in that story the fact that Elijah comes to the edge of the cave twice in the story. And I've only concentrated on the one at the end where he hears the still small voice. But there's the second time he comes to the edge of the cave. First time he's covered, his face is covered with a mask. The second time, there's no mask. He hasn't covered his face. No, let me correct. I think I may have reversed that. That he comes humbly, so he comes masked the second time. He covers his face the second time as though, and I thought, oh, there's a sense in which his pride has disappeared and now he comes out more open, more humble, right? In that sense. So he's not on par with God. He's actually ready and open to hear. And so the fact that I was preaching on this theme changed how I read the story and allowed me to talk more about openness as a way of hearing quiet voices. So I think it does. It impacts how we read Scripture, right? When we're thinking about these aspects of life, right? Jose, you had your hand up.
Yes, sir. Good morning. I just want to thank you for your presentation. A bit of context in my situation. I am a CRE in training. And so, in fact, my next class will go over exegesis and preaching. And so, as a new preacher myself, I am always looking into various ways to have this idea of seeking relevance into transitioning to resonance with the congregation. I preached about a month ago when my pastor was out of town, and the theme was over tribulation, out of all things. And it was very interesting because I wanted to go about it in a way that was relevant and resonant in our lives. And one of the things that I found helpful was that there was another member in my home church who went through the lay pastor training herself. And one of the most greatest advice that she told me, she said, Jose, always analyze Scripture, but also analyze your congregation. And so because I'm 27 years old and the average age in my church is 70, there is a big generational gap. And so how is this 27-year-old young buck is going to be relevant with older adults? And so I had to have a discerning spirit to have hope in the preaching, because of course, I am the future of the church, future generations. And so what was wonderful was that they saw hope in me through the sermon, but also in the future of the church. And we have so many young people nowadays who I would consider ministry innovators, and how, we're talking about programs. And what I've learned through an article in the Presbyterian Outlook that mentions something about the ministry innovation is a thing of relationships over programs. And so, you know, those types of dynamics. And so thank you very much for your presentation. It's just wonderful to be here. Thank you.
My I have two sons. My oldest is 27. And a couple of years ago, he really called me to account on something when he was talking about preaching and why, to be honest, and I say this with some sadness, why he just finds no home in the church at this point in his life. And so I think about that in terms of what you represent. But he said at one point, he said, so much of the preaching, and he said, yours too, Dad. He said, so much of preaching is about the past. I'm young. I have nothing but future.
Yeah.
And he said, and I'm not overly optimistic. I'm tired of people telling me the future is going to be great. And I'm tired of people telling me the future is going to be awful. I just want to know the truth about what lies ahead and what I have to negotiate in the life that I'm giving. He says, that's what I want to hear. And nobody's talking about that. It's all doom and gloom and or great. He says, what about just how do I move forward?
Wow.
And I thought about that, and I thought he was absolutely right. That, and part of it's because I also preach to a congregation we have young families, we have younger people, but the bulk of the congregation are, young retirees who just moved to Scottsdale, right? And so they're at a different point in their lives, and he just reminded me, right, that time looks different at different times of our lives, and we have to pay attention to that, right? Yeah, thanks. Chip had his hand up, and Ruth Ann, I see. So who's first there?
It's so interesting, Teresa, the way you talked about people feel like their lives is out of control. And Shonda, I keep muting you because there's some background noise, but if you want to say something, I'll yield to you now. I can't tell if you have a question or if you're wanting to unmute. Shonda, do you have something you want to ask or add?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had unmuted. My apologies. I have nothing to say.
Okay, well, we're glad you're here, whether you're muted or unmuted. I'm going to mute you back. Because sometimes there's some background noise. Anyway, Teresa, I was thankful for your talking about the issue of people feel out of control. And I want to put that into conversation with something that Bob Gustafson just heard me give a presentation on. But there's a woman, Sherry Turkle, who wrote a book called Alone Together. And Sherry is a philosopher of technology from MIT, because of course MIT has philosophers of technology. And one of the things she talks about is how when technology comes in, it goes from being better than nothing to being better than anything. And along the way, it gives us more of a sense of control. So she makes an example of robot dogs. When robot dogs were introduced in Japan, and people were living in these small apartments and they didn't have access to yards and things. And people would say, oh, well, I can't get a real dog, but at least I can get a robot dog. That's better than nothing. And then when they move someplace where they actually could have a real dog, they say, oh gosh, if I got a real dog, I'd have to take them for a walk. If I had people over, they wouldn't, they'd start barking. I couldn't just turn them off when they wanted. I'll just keep my robot dog. That'll be better. And they miss out on the messiness of life that comes with actually having a dog that you can't control. She said it's the same thing happened with texting, that let's just pretend, Wes, your wife is named Lynn, right? Yeah. So let's just pretend that Lynn is stuck at school when texting first came out, that Lynn is stuck at school, and she says, oh, I can't get away from these kids that need help, but at least I can text Wes to let him know that I'm going to be late. It's better than nothing. It's, it's not like a call, but it's better than nothing. And then as texting becomes more and more prevalent, she starts thinking, oh gosh, if I call Wes, he's going to want to tell me about his day, and he's going to ask me to go to the grocery, and he's, I'll just text him. That'll be better. And that texting, the etiquette of texting is you can just stop texting whenever you want. You don't have to reply. You can start typing something in and then erase it. You miss out on the messiness of the human conversation, the uncontrollability of a human conversation when you're texting. And she wrote this way before the pandemic, but I think the same thing has happened with virtual ministries in churches, where on March the 22nd or 29th of 2020, we all said, oh, I can't go to church live, but at least we can watch it on the screen. It's better than nothing. And then now it's like, oh my gosh, if I'm going to have to go to church on Sunday, I'm going to have to get dressed. I'm going to have to shave. I actually find myself, on the rare occasion I'm not preaching, I actually find myself sometimes laying in bed and saying, I'll just watch it on TV because it's just so much simpler. But that means I don't have to be with that person I don't really like very well. And that means I don't have to have awkward conversations with people. It's all very controlled. And so there's this impulse with technology to be able to control the world that I think the gospel calls us to live in all of its uncontrollability and messiness, so that we actually become more like Christ. Because I think I actually become more like Christ as I interact with that person that drives me crazy, as I rely on the Holy Spirit to keep me from going off on them. I actually become more like Christ when I stick around for a meal that I hadn't planned to, because I spend time with other Christians. And so this better than nothing to better than anything, and the control that we think that gives us, I think really undermines our ability to live out our faith.
That's beautifully said. Thank you. Yeah. I see Ruth Ann has her hand up.
Yeah. So I just really want to thank you. I'm an interim pastor currently. So I have because we work remotely, I was able to take a position at a church in Jackson, Michigan, even though I live near Novi. So I was.
My mother was born in Jackson, Michigan.
Ah, okay, very good. Well, I had about an hour drive this morning. Was listening to you as I was driving in, so I really cannot wait to go back and listen to this full on and not have to have divided attention. But I have to tell you, thank you and I tried to put this in the chat on my phone, but I don't know if it worked. Thank you for your words. When you gave words to an experience, and it actually took a little bit further. About a year ago, I heard someone say that we are experiencing a cultural shift where the entire culture is shifting. And they paralleled it to the cultural shift that happened with the assembly line. And the assembly line changed how we work. It changed how we drive, or how we got from place to place. It changed dating and relationships. I mean, it changed like the whole world in a relatively short period of time. So what we're experiencing now is very much like that. But you kind of took it from just that awareness of that we're living through a cultural shift. You took it to the next step in the conversation for me. So I appreciate that. I think one of the gifts and it left me actually with a lot of hope for the church, maybe not as we knew it, but as it will become, because the church, we all understand mystery, which as you talk today, mystery seems to be what's missing, but mystery is a part of the world. We can't tell. I have kids that are also 25 to 32, and there's a lot of anxiety there. But we can't tell them how their future will be or how adulting will be, because there's mystery. You have to figure it out as you go along. And it's not all going to be easy or all going to be hard. What you're going to face right now, you can't prepare for. It is mystery. And so the church is a group of people that have, in some way, shape, or form, become more comfortable with mystery. So I think we have a really important word to speak into this time. And it actually is a word of hope. You also talked about, when you talked about whether the church, whether churches will be around in 2 years or 10 years, maybe this is actually the best time in the church's history, because we realize that we are vulnerable. And when you are vulnerable, you can do brave things. As a matter of fact, you can't, Brene Brown writes about vulnerability and courage. And essentially in her research, she has come to realize that you can't do something brave without realizing that there is vulnerability and risk with it. And so right now the church is at a point where we realize we're vulnerable. In 1960 in America, the church didn't feel like it was vulnerable. So now we actually get to step into real hope and be who we say we've always been. And are we really up to that? So I think it's a time where the church can choose to step into living really authentically to who we have claimed we are and be that word of hope. So thank you for helping connect those dots for me and taking it that next step. And I encourage all of you to just engage in being in the messy middle. We don't have it figured out yet. So it's just the messy middle.
In the chat, just to sort of extend that a little bit, I think that Michelle writes about the putting alongside of anxiety the question of shame. And I think that's an insight, and I thank you for that, Michelle, that's right, that shame evokes anger. Or you talked about progressive members that shame shows up as despair, and my conservative members as anger. And I think anxiety can produce action. Shame alienates, right? And that part of what I hear what you're saying is that in this moment, we don't need to be ashamed of the moment that the church is in. We can be anxious, maybe that's all right, but because the antidote to anxiety is grace and love and the peace of heart that Christ gives. And yet I think in a lot of the church, because of at least Presbyterians, because of the cultural position we've had historically, we're ashamed of what has become of the church. And I shouldn't say this with a synod executive in the room, but I feel that sometimes when I go to Presbyterian meetings, I'm ashamed. And that's sinful. I shouldn't be ashamed. I can be anxious, but because there's an antidote to anxiety. But the cross is the antidote to shame, and that's already been accomplished. So I don't need to feel shame of where we are, but I think we need to just get busy, right? In a positive way, not in a frightful way or fearful way. But thank you for that. There's another hand. Paula has a hand up.
Yes, hello. I'm feeding people today, and I'm making soup, and we are doing cell phone updates, how to understand your cell phone. I have an elderly congregation. This is an outreach that we're doing. Chip knows I try to be creative with my people to reach out, and so I'm preparing soup and salad. So I'm sorry if people have been watching me, but I'll let you know how it goes at the end. But it's a different way to think about the church and reach out to people differently, and everyone can get some cell phone tips today.
Residents around soup and cell phones. We have one note. I don't see any other hands. I think I find myself, I don't know if this is the right approach or not, it's just what I find happening, that in my own preaching, I'm asking more questions. I think years ago, I gave more answers, and now I'm very explicitly just asking questions of the congregation without answers. Because I'm wondering with the congregation if the right question might open up the logjam for some folks in their life experience. Just ask a question about what difference would this make to you if you heard this text in this way? What difference? Because I don't know the interior of everyone's life. I can't tell them, go out and do this, because I don't know the context of possibility for them. But I do know that a question might evoke some creative wrestling inside of them, right? So I think I might overdo it, but I think that does have an impact sometimes. Just ask questions. Let me ask you all if acceleration is, in your experience and from what you see in folks, is that the right metaphor, the right image, the right sense of what people are experiencing right now, is continual things speeding up, speeding up, speeding up? Or are they, in your congregations, are they in fact slowing down? I mean, is that the right image for the moment?
I
Yeah.
think having a small congregation, as I do, and as I know Barb does, things are slowing down. There's not much energy. People are tired. So there's some truth to that for sure in my context.
Okay. That in some ways the experience of life is again the opposite. That acceleration, which is supposed to produce productivity and engagement and involvement in the world and energy, produces the opposite in a lot of folks. That a lot of these promises that this sort of gambit of modernity, this Rosa's idea of dynamic stabilization, that whole promise fails in some degree. It produces the opposite of what it asks us of. It produces movement, produces resistance, excitement produces exhaustion, rapid accumulation of knowledge produces ignorance. We lose mystery, right? I have recently been going through, my mother, who was born in Jackson, died in February, and so I'm going through her library in her house, and she accumulated a massive library over 92 years of life, much larger than mine, and a beautiful library in many ways. And no one wants books anymore. Can't get rid of them. No one takes the books. But in this library, I found 5 boxes of cookbooks, just cookbooks, 5 boxes, right? And she didn't cook. It was years. My mother hadn't cooked in years, but she still collected cookbooks. And I thought about this, and I thought, this is really curious. Why does she have all these Mediterranean cooking and all this stuff that she never used? So why did she have all this stuff? Especially now when no one will take the cookbooks, because you can just go on the internet and find the recipe, right? So why do you need a cookbook? And that would be the attitude of my children. But I realized for her, cooking was a mystery, that there was always more to learn. It was an adventure. There was always something more. And so she would buy a cookbook at a used book sale because it promised something new, right? And so she would have it, and she would have it in her kitchen because it promised the possibility of a new taste, a new thing, right? Even if she never tried it, it was there as a promise, which is a whole different thing than just holding this, saying, I can just get it on this, don't worry about it. If I want to cook Ethiopian, I can just get a recipe from YouTube. It's just a different experiencing than having a little Ethiopian cookbook on your shelf. So I realized I started thinking about this, and I realized for my mother, it was not about the cooking. It was about having the world on her bookshelf, right, in her kitchen. I think, I don't know, just thinking about that. Charles, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to. I think the acceleration is really a huge piece of what is going on in our culture around us, and a lot of times, if you're not in the accelerating process and you're watching it, which is happening a lot in our congregations. I know it's happening in my congregation. That's what produces the alienation in the first place, and also the alienation is kind of semi-connected to feelings of depression or unfulfillment or that lack of resonance perhaps, that really can deflate people and deflate groups of people and deflate congregations. So I really appreciate this conversation.
Thanks. I know we're heading toward the end, right, Chip? We finish at
Yes, yeah. I was just going to I was going to invite Jose to offer something briefly, and then I'll make just a brief announcement and close this in prayer.
okay, good. Thanks.
Yes, I would say very quickly that in my context, I would say it is a cycle of both of going fast and slowing down. What is slowing us down is that we are having quite a few parishioners dying. I said before, the average age is about 70, 80s, and we're having some key people who have funded the church with their pledge and everything, and so that has been slowing us down. And so, but that doesn't mean that I believe that there is resurrection after death, and so maybe through that power of resurrection, we can see a new life and transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. And for everyone, let's thank Wes also. Wes, thank you so much for your presentation. The substance of all of the comments and conversation indicates how thoughtful what you said was. It was. I'm so grateful for that. I'm really grateful for our friendship and for what I learned here today too. I want to invite you. I failed at the beginning of the time to say what our next session would be. We're not meeting in July because of July 4th, but Amy Moiso, who is the Associate Director of the Louisville Institute and has a PhD in homiletics from Vanderbilt, she'll be leading on preaching in times of conflict. And so I think that will be really helpful since we seem to be in times of conflict all the time, as we've been talking about today. Again, Wes, so thank you so very much. And let me close us in prayer, and then I'll give anybody, I'm sure that Wes will stick around for a couple of minutes if anybody has anything else to talk with him about. So let me close us in prayer. Gracious God, you reign over our culture as it amplifies and as it accelerates and as it accumulates and as it works us towards achievement and all of these things we've been talking about. You reign over our culture, and you reign over our churches, and you reign over us. We pray, oh God, that we would join you in your work in the world, and that we would not feel ashamed, and that we would answer our anxiety with the cross. We thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, who goes before us, and your Spirit, who is underneath us, over top of us, behind us, and at our sides. We pray all of this in your name, our triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all very, very much.